Hello everybody. I want to run down a lesson that I had planned for the end of the year. However, we did not have one last lesson due to some constraints. So I don't know how long this will take, but I hope this is helpful in your revision. So what I had planned to do was kind of just do a rundown of, I don't want to say a quick rundown, it's probably going to take a while, but a rundown of the methodological concepts that we covered this year, and to just kind of give you the strengths and weaknesses of each. And I'm using various sources to run down these strengths and weaknesses. Most of the sources are coming from the past papers. So I'm prioritizing the past papers as a way to delineate strengths and weaknesses. When there are no past papers available, I instead use one of the available textbooks. So I have here different colored texts you'll see on the slides. White text equals past paper, orange black book, blue blue book, and purple purple book. I think it's a good idea in these last couple days during your revision to think about each of these concepts in terms of strengths and weaknesses. And another way of saying this are advantages and disadvantages. Sometimes questions will say strengths or advantages, sometimes they'll say weaknesses or disadvantages. So pretty Chabadoa stuff here. So let's go to the first one. The first one is going to be lab experiments. And the majority of the studies we've seen this year are lab experiments. So you're expected to know several strengths and weaknesses. For each of these slides, by the way, I try to do two if possible. At least one for each, but two if possible. So here we have the strengths of a lab experiment. Now, of course, a lab is a highly controlled environment, so it's going to have a lot of control of IV over DV, and there's a lot of standardization. Now, those kind of things go hand in hand, but remember, standardization is about reliability, and control is about validity. So usually pretty good reliability and validity because of those. Now, in a lab experiment, people know they're in a study because they came to a lab, right? So there's going to be more likely to be guessing of what the aim is and perhaps some demand characteristics. Please don't confuse demand characteristics with socially desirable answers. Demand characteristics is when you give the researcher what you think they want. Socially desirable answers is when you say things that you think society expects of you. And of course, most lab experiments will be lacking in ecological validity. So while the internal validity is good, the ecological validity may be poor. Okay, conversely, we have field experiments, and a lot of the stuff we said about the previous slide, we could say in opposite. So because it's realistic, it has good ecological validity. And oftentimes the people don't know they're being watched or studied, so there's less likely to be demand characteristics. And of course, the only field experiment we had in the core studies was the Pilyavin study. But life is messy, society is messy, so there's less likely to be controls. And also, in certain situations where you're looking at people in a public place, they don't know they're in a study, so of course there's no informed consent, and they are being deceived in some regard, especially if there's some sort of manipulation, like in the Pilyavin study. Okay, moving on to questionnaires. So questionnaires, these are taken from past papers, so you could read these verbatim, and I encourage you to pause the slides whenever you want, but I'll just give it in a short way. Questionnaires are usually done with a person alone, so maybe it's less likely that they're going to be dishonest. Like if you were talking to a group of people, sometimes they'll want to have socially desirable answers, but here it's just you and the paper, and if you're ensured that the paper is going to be anonymous or not shared, then that's a good thing. And it's easy to get many participants with a questionnaire. You guys do questionnaires all the time. You fill them out all the time, only a few minutes, using either old school questionnaires or new school methods such as social media questionnaires. However, they're still capable of giving untruthful answers. They might want to look good, or they might want to come out the way that they think they want to come out. And so this could also lower the validity of the findings, especially if you know what the questionnaire is looking for. Many of you in your own designs would create filler questions to avoid this type of thing. Okay, interviews. Now I'm handling interviews both structured and unstructured. Now structured is very good because it's easy to compare responses. So if I was interviewing a bunch of people for a job, I could compare Mary's answers with Tom's answers because we asked the same questions. However, structured interviews could be a little bit constricting and may not fit everybody. Okay, unstructured interviews allow you to change the question. So therefore, it's a little bit more malleable, a little bit more fitting the person you're asking questions to. Excuse me. So if I was interviewing teachers, I might ask different questions of a history teacher than I would for a geography teacher. Okay, we shouldn't be asking the same questions to those two different fields. The negative is that when you're face-to-face, you're less likely to give truthful answers. This is where social desirability comes into play. So if I ask somebody, are you racist? Of course, they're going to say no. So that's one of the problems. When you conduct interviews, you should mention what type of questions you're using. And many of us like to use open questions because open questions allow for more in-depth information, and therefore it could be more valid, could be more fitting to the person's situation. They could explain the motivations for their answers. If you only ask closed questions like yes or no, they may not explain why they're saying yes or why they're saying no. The bad thing is that open questions are hard to analyze because they're non-numerical, they're not quantitative. So there's a temptation by many of us to just get this as easy to analyze as possible by using things like Likert scales or yes or no questions. And many of these open questions depend upon interpretation. So if I said something to you like, how do you feel when you hear this song? There's like 18,000 things you could possibly say. So therefore, we want to sometimes avoid open questions to make our lives easier. Okay, we recently came across case studies in the second semester because we had two case studies. We had the case study with the button phobia, and we had a weird one with a parrot, which is sort of a case study with a lab experiment, or a lab experiment that is a case study. So case studies produce detailed data about rare cases. Now, in both those cases, with the button phobia and Alex, they are unique. So they're very good for studying things that are not found widely in the general population. And many methods are used when we run case studies usually. So therefore, we could have some sort of concurrent validity checks, or we triangulate the data. We have one piece of data trying to confirm another piece of data. So does the interview match the observation? The bad thing is, though, the case study might be too unique and therefore very difficult to generalize to the population. So the button phobia situation, well, does everyone's phobia form from that kind of traumatic experience, or does it have an element of disgust in it? So disgust was a very focal point, a very big focal point of that study. But some may say, well, not everybody is disgusted by the thing that they fear. Another problem that could come up, and this is more true for older psychological studies that were case studies, is that there could be some sort of attachment that forms between the people doing the research and the people being researched. I think I shared with you a famous example of a woman named Eve White / Eve Black, and there was lots of questioning of how there was some sort of inappropriate attachment formed between the researcher and the person who was observed or studied. Okay, covert observation. This is your favorite types of observation. When you guys are asked to do research on paper 2, a lot of you choose to do covert observation. You don't have to use it all the time. As a matter of fact, it might be a bad idea to, for example, put a camera in somebody's house. Many students said, oh, I'm going to put a CCTV camera in somebody's house and they're not going to know about it. Your studies should be ethical. Okay, covert observation is probably best in a public setting. So because of the hidden nature of the observer, they're not making themselves known, people will behave more naturally and have fewer demand characteristics and less social desirability. Again, those are two different ideas: social desirability and demand characteristics. However, keeping your role hidden might make it hard for you yourself to see. Now, this is probably not a big a deal nowadays because I guess we could use cell phones in accompaniment with our observation. But think about Pilyavin, you don't know how many people are blocking your view. Covert observation is done without the consent of the participants, so there's a bit of a ethical concern there. I don't want to say it's unethical, but I don't like to use the word unethical too easily. I would say there's some ethical concerns. I like to be a little bit more nuanced about these things. And if the participants find out they were being watched the whole time, they may feel some sort of distress. They may feel some sort of paranoia, like, why is this person, interested in me? So yeah, there are some negatives. Okay, let's go to structured observations. Now, I'm not going to do all the types of observations, but I'm choosing the ones that I know have been asked about on past papers. So structured observation has an objective, reliable list of different behaviors. Now, this is what we call sometimes the behavioral checklist. And this gives you more focus, and it kind of makes your life a little bit easier rather than recording everything. So when you're using this checklist, you are ticking things, usually accumulating them quantitatively, and then later you can make comparisons. Think about the comparisons that were made in something like Bandora, okay, kicking the doll, punching the doll. So it's easier to make those sort of comparisons from group to group. Now, the problem is that the behavior might be too restrictive. So sometimes people might get creative or might do something that was not anticipated by the researchers. Now, Bandora does check for this as well. He does make usually qualitative mentions of things that were done outside of the checklist, but it may be too narrow. So you want to run a pilot first, probably, to figure out what the range of behaviors would be. Okay, so again, the negative might be it's too restrictive. Another word for that would be narrow or too small of a checklist. Okay, let's go to participant observations. Now, the participant observations are very good because you are involved with it directly. You're in the action. And so you could see and hear things clearly. This is very different than perhaps a non-participant covert observation. Now, observers are more likely to understand the motives and reasons as well because they could actually maybe follow up and say, hey, why are you doing that? Or something like that. And that could also increase the validity of the findings. But oftentimes these participant observers are new to a group, and so the presence of an outsider can change the behaviors of that group. Now think about when you meet a stranger, sometimes people are more polite, they're a little bit more guarded, they're trying to create a good first impression. So that could also be a problem in the validity. Are people acting naturally? So non-participant observation is clearly more objective. You're standing away from it. Sometimes you might be too close. So in this picture, this guy is watching, but he's not playing. The negative is the observer can be too absorbed in the social situation. Now, I don't really understand that as a negative, but I did find that from one of the past paper questions, so I will accept it as a negative or as a weakness. I guess how could you become too absorbed? Maybe you're just watching so carefully or you get really enjoying what you're seeing that you've lost sight of what you're supposed to be looking for. I'm not sure. Okay, let's shift gears here and move into correlations. Now, I've said this many times. Correlations do not show causation. So the first thing I think of is actually the weakness. And I want you to constantly repeat that to yourself. Correlation does not mean cause and effect. So one of the most famous examples of there being no cause and effect, or one of the ones I use in class, is that people who fall asleep with their shoes on are more likely to have a headache in the morning. Now, those two things are actually true. People who sleep in their shoes are more likely to have a headache, but one is not causing the other because there might be a third variable that is overlooked. In that case, the third variable might be that person was sleeping in his shoes because he had been drinking the night before and he passed out. Or another one is, what's the more famous one? The number of ice cream sold correlates with the number of murders. And the missing variable there might be something like either population or temperature. People tend to be out more in warmer weather. Now, correlations can be used to investigate variables that cannot be manipulated. So the example of Baron Cohen is a good one because you can't manipulate one's autism quotient score, nor their ability to read people's emotions. Now, is there a relationship there? There probably is, but this is a correlation. This is not necessarily experimental. The whole thing itself is a natural experiment, but the method being used in that particular instance is correlational. So I feel like I've said the same thing twice here. I guess I grabbed it from two different tests. Correlations can be used to investigate variables that cannot be manipulated. Maybe it'll be unethical to manipulate those variables. So people who are in poverty are more likely to do poorly at school or something. You're not going to purposely put somebody in poverty or make them poor. Correlations can find relationships, and this could help us maybe plan for future investigations. So maybe one other way of thinking about that is maybe if you're interested in something, see if something correlational exists, and then think about doing an experimental design. Speaking of experimental designs, let's go into the way that people are either split up or not split up in IV conditions. If people are split up according to IV conditions, we call this independent groups. Now, the less you are exposed to the experimental conditions, condition A or condition B, the less likely you are to guess what the purpose of the study may be. Think about Schachter and Singer. I mean, could you imagine if the person was, shot with Ciproxin or the epinephrine and then shot with the placebo? He would probably figure out there's something weird going on here. I'm in a study, and the waiting room is the actual experimental room. So if you only take part in one part, you're going to be relatively more ignorant or naive to the purpose of the test or the experiment. And you're less likely to have order effects in a independent group's design. So we'll talk about order effects a little bit later when we talk about repeated measures in a moment. However, when you use independent groups, there could be profound individual differences. So if I took half the class on the left side and the class on the right side, and I put you in two different groups, and I want to see how some drug affects your basketball performance, well, maybe I just got unlucky, and maybe everybody on the left side of the room was on the basketball team. So it's very, very likely that unless you use a matched pairs design, that individual differences could play a role. If you're using repeated measures, however, you're using the same people. So if I have 3 basketball players in condition A, those same 3 basketball players are going to be in condition B, so there's not going to be much of an outlier effect. And we see this type of design in the Yamamoto study. So if one chimpanzee tends to be more, cognitively developed or more intelligent than another one, well, that intelligence will carry over regardless of whether he's in condition A, which is the transparent glass, or condition B, which is the opaque or non-transparent glass. However, when you do things over and over again, you could have something called an order effect. And in the case of Yamamoto, the order effect that you should be worried about is practice. Because maybe they're choosing the right tool not because they are experiencing the conditions differently, but maybe because they themselves are just getting better at a task. Think about if I were doing an experiment with a video game and I want to see if loud music affects performance on a video game. If I do in silence first and then I do it with noise second, well, your performance is going to be impacted by the fact that you've had practice in the first condition. So we've talked about this before, but please remember that one way you could check to see if there are order effects is you could use something called counterbalancing, where sometimes people do condition A first and sometimes people do condition B first, and you kind of compare to see if there was practice. The other order effect that's not written here is the fatigue effect. Fatigue being a word meaning I'm getting tired. Maybe you're doing something that's strenuous, either mentally or physically, and you're just getting more and more tired. There's a third effect, which is sort of related to fatigue, which is called the boredom effect. Maybe something was exciting the first 5 minutes, but after doing it for 3 hours, you're quite no longer stimulated by the activity, so now you're bored. Okay, moving on, let's go on to quantitative data. Now, quantitative data is kind of easy for most people because they understand that numbers tend to be more objective than perhaps qualitative, which is obviously more subjective. So I don't have a slide for qualitative, but you could sort of reverse what's written here for qualitative. So if things are numerical, scores can be easily compared, analyzed, etc. And then you could run statistical analysis, calculate the mean, measures of spread, all that good stuff. However, just like we talked about earlier when we talked about open versus closed-ended questions, if the answers are binary, like yes or no, or a rating scale that's too small, maybe on a rating scale of 1 to 3 or 1 to 5, then we don't know much else about what the person is thinking. We don't know their motivation for the answers they gave. Another thing that could be said, and this is in the blue textbook, and I like it, is that it could be accused of being reductionist. Now, reductionism is a concept that we'll talk about much more in A2 year. But if you're curious about what reductionism is, it essentially means you're taking very complicated ideas and you're sort of oversimplifying them. So, if I'm taking a poll and I say, how do you feel about, the President of the United States on a scale of 1 to 5? And the person says 3. Well, there's a lot of things that go into a political leader, his economic positions, his international warfare positions, things like that. So it might be a little too simple to give a number to a very complicated idea. Okay, let's move on to the types of sampling. Volunteer sampling. We see volunteer sampling in studies like Schachter and Singer, Milgram, and the Canley study. Some people think that the Andrade study on doodling is also volunteer, but it's not because they were in a previous study that they volunteered for, but they were asked to stay for a few minutes for another study. So actually, Andrade is opportunity. Anyway, so when you get volunteer sampling, you could obtain a range of different occupations depending on how you advertise. So in the Milgram study, they got both blue-collar and white-collar people, and they purposely positioned it that way in the advertisement. They wanted to get many different types of people. So you could also be specific about what types of people you're looking for. So for example, if you need people that have autism, and that's the case with the Baron-Cohen study in part. So with group 1, they had to find people with autism. I believe they took out an advertisement in some sort of autism publication. So you could be very specific about what you're looking for in your ad. Now, however, you could sometimes have a very non-generalizable population because let's say you took out an advertisement in a magazine. Well, maybe you're only getting the people who would be looking at that type of magazine. Or another consideration is that maybe the people who joined your study are having more free time than those who did not. So maybe there's some sort of common feature in them of willingness to be in a study. Think about if I said to the students, hey, at 4:30 today, I'm going to do a study. Who would like to come? I think the people who would come would be those who are the most maybe overachieving, or those maybe who don't have any sort of extracurricular activities after school. So this could be a problem with generalizability. Opportunity sampling is the favorite of me and the students because when we do experiments at school, we just happen to find those people that are in our classroom or in the corridor or just walking around campus. So this is an easy and quick way to obtain participants because they're available, they're convenient. However, because of that, you're unlikely to get a wide variety of participants. Again, think about the school. So if I just found people who are walking around campus, it's likely they're going to be of the same age and the same, perhaps, social class. So perhaps the school has a certain tuition fee that can only be afforded by people of a certain economic class. So that could limit our generalizability. Okay, let's talk a little bit about animals. So what's so good about using animals in research? Well, we assume that animals can't really work out the aim of a study. They don't know why we're looking at them. Maybe some people give animals more credit for being more aware or intelligent than we think, or most people think, but for the most part, they're pretty naive, we assume. And there are certain things that we cannot do on humans because the ethical guidelines for humans are much more strict than they are for animals. So, for example, this is from the past paper. It says, for example, lesioning is not possible with humans. What does lesioning mean? It means removing part of the brain. I don't know why the exam says that because there's no example of lesioning in our studies, but we do see, for example, all the time animals being tested with drugs, maybe some sort of vaccine or something. So we usually don't want to use people for the first round of drug testing. The negative, and this is from the Purple Book, is we could only observe the way animals behave. We cannot really ask them for reasons for their behavior. Even Alex, as smart as Alex is, can't really give a motivation for why he chose yellow instead of orange. He can't explain why he made the mistake. Okay, mathematical matters. They sometimes ask about the strengths and weaknesses of things like the mean. And they've never asked about the median and mode as far as I remember, but they've asked about the mean. And the good thing about a mean, as opposed to maybe other measures of central tendency like the median or the mode, is that it takes into account all of the data points, so it's more representative of all the data. The negative, however, is it could ignore the effect of outliers. And this is why measures of spread might be more meaningful to look at sometimes, because there might be something that's messing up the majority of the data because it's like one person who outperformed or underperformed the other people. And it does not really provide much information about how things are spread around. So again, the weaknesses are mostly that it's not standard deviation. Standard deviation does take all the accounts, all the scores into account as well. So it, like the mean, is more representative than maybe something like, the range. But the standard deviation takes into account outliers, or actually it's more resistant to outliers messing up the numbers. I don't know if I could explain this with a simple example. So if most people in a small class got 70% on an exam, but one person got a 10, well, the standard deviation is not really going to be that impacted by that huge difference, whereas the mean could be very impacted by it. As far as the drawbacks go, I've seen nothing. They've never asked what are the drawbacks of standard deviation, and if anyone can think of one, I would be happy to hear it. Maybe a drawback is that it's hard to calculate without using some sort of algorithmic software. I'm not sure. Anyway, I'm stuck for things to say about that. All right, let's go on to a new concept, or a newer concept that we covered in the second half of the year. That's random allocation. I pointed this out to people because I found that students were confusing the idea of random sampling, which is something we don't see in any of our studies in AS year, with random allocation. So random allocation simply means that the people who are in your study have an equal chance of being in any of the IV conditions. So in an experiment I ran in the classroom, I think I used poker cards, and if you had a red card, you were in group A, and if you had a black card, you were in group B. This is sort of a way for me as an experimenter to avoid bias in the way I allocate my participants. So maybe if I'm looking for a certain result, I'll have people with a certain talent or ability in one group over the other group. So my strength that I'm giving here is that it reduces some sort of experimenter bias in the way people are put in groups. But on the past paper that I'm citing here, it says the following. Random allocation reduces the effect of confounding variables such as individual differences. And they use the Laney study as an example. So participants the participants could have really loved asparagus or not, regardless of whatever group they were put into, whether it was the love group or the control group. So there was no, I guess that kind of agrees with what I said before. There was no manipulation where you were looking for a certain result. So you put all the asparagus lovers in one place and the asparagus haters in another place. The weakness here is that it does not completely overcome the potential for participant variables. So just like we talked about with independent groups before, you might just get unlucky. And this is especially true when you have smaller groups. So maybe the people who were allocated in one group had a specific ability that those in the second group did not have. Again, I just want to repeat, please do not confuse random allocation with random sampling. As a matter of fact, don't worry too much about random sampling because we've seen no studies with it. In A2 year, we might. Okay, the way this lesson was supposed to close out was I was going to give you these past paper questions that have asked about strengths and weaknesses before. And if you want this document, I'll be happy to send it to you. But look through those past papers, do a Command F or Control F, and search for the word strength, weaknesses, advantages, or disadvantages to practice some of these questions. One last point I will make is that I want you to be aware that sometimes they will ask you about strengths and weaknesses without directly linking to the methodological term that is on the syllabus. And I believe the motivation for doing this is to prevent students from just memorizing strengths and weaknesses. They want to actually see some real thinking in real time. So let's look at this question as an example. JC is conducting a laboratory experiment to investigate the effects of eating chocolate on mood. That sounds like a fun experiment. She predicts that eating chocolate will make people happier than not eating chocolate. That's what is that, a one-tailed hypothesis? Is that right? She has 20 participants. Then we're told that JC gave each participant a number from 1 to 20. She has a hat which contains cards that are numbered from 1 to 20. She takes 10 cards from the hat and uses the 10 people with those numbers as her control group. She uses the remaining 10 participants as her experimental group. Explain one strength of this part of JC's procedure. Now, I read all this because we just spoke about random allocation, yet here is a question asking for a strength of random allocation without actually using the term. All right, and there are other examples of questions like this. They're not very frequent, but they do happen from time to time. So be aware you could be asked about a concept without that concept being named. Okay, y'all, I hope you have some good exams, you enjoy your learning, and that you gained something beneficial from this video. I don't know what else to say other than good luck, jayo, and keep it healthy.